Muy buenas tardes. En principio, quiero presentar al profesor Michael Byers. Él es profesor de Ciencia Política de la Universidad de Columbia Británica, donde ocupa la Cátedra de Investigación de Canadá en Política Global y Derecho Internacional. También codirige el Instituto del Espacio Exterior. La investigación del profesor Byers se centra en el espacio exterior, el Ártico, los conflictos armados y la política exterior canadiense. El profesor Byers también ha sido miembro del Jesus College de la Universidad de Oxford, profesor de Derecho de la Universidad de Duke y profesor invitado en las universidades de Ciudad del Cabo, Tel Aviv, Novosibirsk y Noruega y por supuesto también de la UNAM. El profesor Byers va a hacer una presentación que titula Who Owns Outer Space? United States Policy Puts the Safe and Sustainable Development of Space at Risk. Un título bastante sugestivo que dice mucho. Este trabajo lo realizó la investigación de él con el profesor Aaron Bowley, que es un profesor de Political Science y es profesor asociado y jefe de la astronomía planetaria en Canadá y el Departamento de Física y Astronomía de la Facultad de Ciencias de la Universidad de British Columbia. Michael, it's a pleasure to have you here. You have the microphone.
Gracias, Manuel. It's a great pleasure to be here and to be in the company of so many distinguished experts in international space law. Now you might wonder what I can add to this discussion, and I've been thinking that myself. But let me briefly introduce to you two aspects of my work that I think can add insights to everything we've heard so far today and we'll hear this afternoon. The first is that throughout my career, I've worked closely with natural scientists. So I've done a lot of work on the oceans and the Arctic, and so I've consistently interacted with oceanographers, with climatologists, with physicists who study sea ice and glaciers, and this has made me both comfortable and actually eager to interact with natural scientists in the areas that I work. And obviously space is a domain where understanding the physics is absolutely central to solving many of the problems. And that is in large part why I have partnered with Professor Aaron Bowley, who is an astrophysicist, and he and I together have co-authored several articles in the last couple of years, including with regards to the topic of space mining, a short article in the journal Science, which was published in October 2020. And that article is going to help anyone who's interested in my talk to fully understand what I am saying, because that article has more detail than what I can provide today. So Science, October 2020. If you want to get around the paywall, just go to the website of the Outer Space Institute and you will find open access to this article there. So science, international law coming together, that's one thing that I can do. The second, and as Manuel well knows, I've long had an interest in the the politics of international lawmaking. And this goes back to when we first met, working on the effects of U.S. hegemony on the foundations of international law. And so when I look at space policy and space law today, the first thing that I see, given my background, are the politics, the diplomacy, the strategies of lawmaking that are being applied. So let me speak first of all to the science dimension of this issue of space mining. Lost in much of the discussion about space mining, the excitement of space mining, are the very considerable risks associated with space mining. And let me give you just a couple of examples. The first is that in terms of expanding humanity's knowledge of the universe and of our own origins, there are likely materials on the moon and on asteroids that are absolutely critical that we obtain and study either in place or after removing them for scientific purposes. Not for commercial exploitation, but for scientific purposes. Asteroids contain the oldest materials in the solar system. There are amino acids on asteroids that could provide the key to understanding the origins of life. The moon has been bombarded by meteoroids throughout its whole history and is an absolute resource of scientific evidence, not just natural resources, but scientific evidence. And space mining, if done incautiously, if done without scientific input, could destroy that evidence before it can be studied. So one of the big risks of space mining is that it destroys scientific evidence, that we don't let the scientists examine the materials first. Let me give you another example of a risk. The moon has a very low escape velocity and is covered with dust, very fine but highly abrasive, very sharp dust. And any activity on the surface of the moon could cause plumes of dust to rise, not just a short distance up, but out into actual orbit around the moon. So what is all this abrasive dust going to do when it for instance, lands on the incredibly important archaeological site called the Apollo 11 landing site in the Sea of Tranquility, one of the most important historic sites in the history of humanity? What about this dust landing there? What about this dust interfering with scientific exploration, interfering with the operations of space agencies? What about dust reaching lunar orbits and interfering with satellites and spacecraft there? This is an incredible risk that is understudied, underappreciated in the context of the moon. And also, to give you another example, we talk about space debris in Earth orbit. We don't talk about space debris in lunar orbit, but we need to. There are relatively few stable lunar orbits that are actually useful. Because the moon is smaller and it's not balanced in the same way as Earth in terms of its gravitational forces. And of course, there are the gravitational interferences that come from Earth. So lunar orbits are very limited in terms of their utility. There are only a few that are stable, that can be used for long periods of time. And so a small amount of debris in those stable lunar orbits could interfere with our access, our use of the moon for generations, for centuries to come. We need to talk about space debris in terms of space mining, in terms of activities on the moon. And then if you engage in the mining of asteroids, you need to worry about debris also. Asteroids have very low escape velocities. Mining is going to produce debris. That debris is going to turn into streams of debris on the same orbit as the asteroid. And the asteroids that we will be mining will be asteroids that pass close to Earth because we need to get to them. And so you have the prospect of debris streams from asteroid mining passing through Earth orbits, threatening satellites. This is something that needs to be understood, needs to be part of the planning of space mining missions. And to give you a worst case scenario, if you're mining an asteroid, you are removing mass from the asteroid. And you're unlikely to be removing that mass equally from all sides of the asteroid. So there's a pretty good chance that you will alter the trajectory of the asteroid, that you will slightly change its direction by engaging in mining. Now, again, these are near-Earth asteroids. They pass close to Earth. And there is a risk, a very small risk, but a high consequence risk, that space mining could actually put an asteroid onto an Earth impact trajectory. So anyone who wants to engage in space mining should have to engage in very careful calculations, astrophysical calculations of the potential effects of their mining on the trajectory of the asteroid. Now, here's the really big issue, is do we trust private companies to do these kinds of careful scientific assessments? Do we trust a single national regulatory agency to ensure that these careful scientific protections are in place? We might trust the United States because it has highly competent regulatory agencies. We might trust the government of Luxembourg. What if a space mining company were to incorporate in a flag of convenience state? Would we then trust that national government to ensure that these scientific-based protections are in place? So risks are a big factor, and space lawyers and space policy experts need to engage with the scientists to understand the risks, to understand the necessary protections, and also to convince national governments that this has to be done collectively to provide that collective regulatory protection, to avoid the risk of flag of convenience states, to avoid the risks associated with private companies driven by profit motives seeking to reduce their costs. So that's the first part of my talk. The second part of my talk focuses on the politics of international lawmaking. And here we have the United States, which is driving an effort at clarifying international space law in favor of its own interests, and as the state of incorporation of the majority of significant space companies, its interest is as it sees it in supporting industry. And so it seeks to promote an understanding of international law that allows for commercial space mining. Now, I don't need to tell this audience that this debate goes back to Article 2 of the 1967 Outer Space Treaty. You've already heard that today from some of my colleagues. The only point I want to make about Article 2 is that one can interpret Article 2 of the Outer Space Treaty in different ways in good faith, that the Outer Space Treaty, with regards to the issue of space mining, is not clear. Now, I've gone back and looked at the travaux préparatoires, the negotiating records for the Outer Space Treaty, and it's pretty clear to me that the negotiators did not see commercial space mining as a significant issue in 1967, and they were quite happy to delay that issue, negotiations on that issue, to a later day. And you could argue that the Moon Agreement, the 1979 Moon Treaty, is in fact the result of those further negotiations. And I'm very pleased that Mexico is a party to that treaty. But my point is that there is at least arguably ambiguity in Article 2 of the Outer Space Treaty, and that the United States has sought to influence the international community with regards to Article 2, arguing that one should interpret it as allowing commercial space mining, and seeking to create subsequent practice with regards to the interpretation of the treaty, and in parallel to that, in customary international law. Now, to make a long story short, part of this goes back to 2015 in the Commercial Space Utilization Act, where the United States asserted that US citizens have the right to own minerals extracted in space under US law. And of course, Luxembourg followed this, and the United Arab Emirates opened the door to it, didn't walk through yet, but we have a movement among a few countries in this direction. And then the Trump administration came along. And with the Trump administration, Scott Pace and Mike Gold and Jim Bridenstine, three individuals very much committed to furthering an acceptance of commercial space mining. And so we saw a flurry of activity last year. We saw an executive order signed by President Trump last May, a year ago, asserting a right of commercial space mining, dismissing the idea of a global commons, rejecting the relevance of the Moon Agreement, and instructing the State Department to seek international acceptance of a right of commercial space mining. NASA then announced that it would be negotiating something called the Artemis Accords, with a view to getting other countries to explicitly accept the US view. And then in September of last year, Jim Bridenstine, the then administrator of NASA, announced that NASA would be signing contracts with private companies to purchase minerals extracted from the surface of the moon, and said explicitly that they were doing so to create a legal precedent. In other words, state practice for the purposes of treaty interpretation and customary international law. So this is strategic and actually quite explicit, quite public. So someone like me who's interested in these things can see this trail of strategic activity. Now, what's important here is that the US has not succeeded completely in this effort. And we know this because of the release of the text of the Artemis Accords. Now, there are two things to be said about the Artemis Accords. First of all, they are not treaties. In fact, Article 1 of the Artemis Accords is explicit that this is simply a political commitment to the principles set out in the document. So it's maybe a piece of soft law, but in no way can it be considered a hard law of any kind. And secondly, in Section 10 of the Artemis Accords, you find a very strange wording that simply says that, and I'm not going to put it up on my screen, but I'm going to read it out to you because it's quite peculiar. And it says, the signatories affirm that the extraction of space resources does not inherently constitute national appropriation under Article 2 of the Outer Space Treaty, and that contracts and other legal instruments relating to space resources should be consistent with that treaty. Only lawyers could come up with that kind of sentence because it's a compromise. It allows room for the United States view, and it allows room for a different view. And I can tell you that these compromises in the Artemis Accords, which the United States did not want, it did not want those compromises, are there because of pushback from the other countries that were invited to join. Now, the United States, being very strategic, only invited its key space allies to sign on to the Artemis Accords, right? Countries that have the possibility of getting astronaut slots on the moon, big attraction for politicians. And yet, although these countries like Canada and Australia and the United Kingdom and Italy signed the Artemis Accords, they pushed back during the negotiations. And I would suggest that the country that was most important in this pushback during the negotiations was a party to the 1979 Moon Agreement, namely Australia, that did not want to have a contradiction in the legal commitments under the Outer Space Treaty and the text of the Artemis Accords. So the lesson here is that this is a situation that is diplomatically engaged. There is no set conclusion. And it's very important that countries, especially from the global south, become involved in this issue. And in our article in Science, Professor Bowley and I discuss a couple of precedents here, the most important of which is probably Part 11 of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, where we got to a result that was not what the United States wanted. We got the area, we got the International Seabed Authority, we got the common heritage of mankind. And the United States has not ratified UNCLOS. And indeed, it pushed for a renegotiation of Part 11 to make it less objectionable to the United States. But we have a treaty that is in force among the vast majority of the world's countries, and we have an acceptance by successive United States administrations that UNCLOS represents customary international law. So we need the global south to come in on this issue of space mining, to push for an approach that is multilateral, that is science-based, that avoids the kinds of risks that I was talking about in the first part of this presentation. The game is not over. The game has just begun. The United States has kicked the ball down the field, and the rest of us now have to respond. And I say this also, as a Canadian, because like Mexico, Canada has learned to work with the United States, but never sacrificing our sovereignty. So we can cooperate, we can achieve collective ends, but we do not take the position of the United States as the necessary conclusion when it comes to international law and diplomacy. The only other thing I want to say, just in closing, is that there has been a change of administration in Washington. And this is a good thing for this and many other issues. The Biden administration is open to a multilateral approach to space mining. It is supporting the creation of an ad hoc committee on this issue within the subcommittee, supporting the creation of a working group within the subcommittee on legal affairs at COPUS, at the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. So there is an opportune moment here to move forward. I could talk about the tensions between the State Department and the US military on this issue. I could talk about the particular challenges that are created by Elon Musk and his ambitions to not just go to the moon, but go to Mars. But I think I've said enough. Again, all I bring to the table is an understanding to some degree of the relevance of the physics, the science to these issues, and then alongside that, an understanding that that this isn't just about law. This is about the politics of law. So, muchas gracias. And if anyone has any questions, I would love to hear from you either now or by email. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Michael. Indeed, it was very interesting, your talk, because you focus in things that sometimes we lawyers forget. I mean, in this case, the money space, and the second one, the politics and space. These are very important. So we have a little bit time. If you have, si tienen alguna pregunta, se la podemos hacer ahora a Michael. Vemos que esta es una exposición un tanto diferente a la que hemos visto, porque está centrado en la cuestión de la política en el espacio ultraterrestre y la cuestión que es importante, el dinero, ¿qué pasa? Varios ponentes han expresado precisamente que hay un fenómeno precisamente de privatización del espacio, precisamente por la participación de las compañías privadas. Y es bueno entonces hacer preguntas. ¿Tenemos alguna pregunta? Vemos el chat.
So the U.S. military, I mean, there are different views within the U.S. military, but one camp within the U.S. military sees space as a warfighting domain and wants the United States to achieve dominance in space. And the Trump administration gave this camp within the US military a great deal of new power and influence. And the declaration of space as a warfighting domain by President Trump was part of that. But what is most disturbing to me is that two US military research agencies are now planning to extend their activities beyond Earth orbits and into what's called cislunar space. So the US Air Force Research Laboratory is building two spacecraft that will go into cislunar space. And one of them is actually designed to engage in proximity operations, which means it will have the potential, the technological capability to interfere with other spacecraft. So that's a big problem. Militaries have never gone beyond Earth orbit, and now the US military is planning to do so. The other agency is DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. And just 2 months ago, it announced a new project with funding to study technologies that could be used in cislunar space and on the moon. And anyone who has read the Outer Space Treaty knows that military activities on the moon are strictly illegal. So all of a sudden, we have a direct challenge to that fundamental provision of the Outer Space Treaty coming from a US military research agency. I'm hoping that the Biden administration will wake up to what these agencies are doing and stop them. But the best way to ensure that these are stopped is to make this as public as possible.
Okay. Thank you very much. We don't have now time. Michael, indeed, it's a pleasure to hear you again to talk about these very interesting topics. And we are going to pass to the next block. Mónica Nuño is now. Thank you very much, Michael. Mónica is now with us now to present the next table. Thank you, Michael.